It was a warm afternoon in the bustling streets of Greenville. Life carried on as usual, with people moving through their routines, some smiling, some hurried, and some lost in their own thoughts. Among the crowd was Millie, a striking black woman with an air of confidence and grace. She walked with purpose, wearing a simple yet elegant dress that flowed with the rhythm of her steps. Around her neck was a golden chain, its brilliance catching the sunlight. It wasn't just an accessory. It was a symbol of love, a cherished gift from her husband Noah. As Millie passed by a row of parked police cruisers, Officer Joe leaned against one of the cars sipping his coffee. Joe was a seasoned cop, but not in the way that garnered respect. His years on the force had bred arrogance rather than wisdom, and he carried himself with an inflated sense of authority. Joe's uniform, to him, was more than a symbol of duty. It was a license to exert control, often in ways that crossed ethical lines. His prejudices ran deep, and he saw the world in shades of division rather than unity. Joe's eyes caught the gleam of Millie's chain, and something about her demeanor irked him. She didn't seem intimidated by his presence, didn't lower her gaze or quicken her steps like others might. Instead, she walked past him without a second glance. To Joe, it felt like a challenge, as if she were dismissing his authority. His ego bristled. "Hey you," he called out sharply, setting his coffee on the hood of the car. Millie stopped and turned, her brow furrowed in mild confusion. "Yes, officer?" she asked politely, though her voice carried an undertone of caution. Joe approached her, his expression stern. "That chain around your neck, where'd you get it?" His tone wasn't one of curiosity but accusation. Millie blinked, taken aback. "It's mine," she replied calmly. "It was a gift from my husband." Joe folded his arms, scrutinizing her. "A gift, huh? Looks pretty expensive. Are you sure it's yours? You match the description of someone reported for theft." Millie's face hardened slightly. "I assure you, officer, I haven't stolen anything. This chain is mine." But Joe wasn't interested in her explanation. He'd already decided she didn't belong, that her presence and her possession of such a valuable item were suspicious. His biases clouded his judgment, and his sense of authority swelled. "A likely story," he scoffed. "People like you always have excuses." Millie's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "People like me?" she asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Joe stepped closer, his posture intimidating. "You know exactly what I mean. Now I need you to come with me for questioning. We'll sort this out at the station." "I haven't done anything wrong," Millie said firmly, though her heart raced with frustration. "This is a mistake." Joe's lips curled into a smirk. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can walk around with stolen jewelry and get away with it. Let's go." Millie's patience began to wear thin, but she refused to let him see her anger. Instead, she tried reason. "Officer, I'm asking you to think carefully about what you're doing. This chain is mine, and I've done nothing to warrant this treatment. Please don't make a decision you'll regret." But her words only seemed to fuel Joe's ego. "Regret? Oh, I don't think so. This is fun for me. Putting people like you in your place, it's part of the job." Millie's stomach churned at his words, but she maintained her composure. "I'm warning you," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "You don't know who I am, and you don't know what you're doing." Joe laughed, a mocking sound that echoed down the street. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. Now stop stalling." As he reached for his handcuffs, Millie made a decision. Without drawing attention, she slipped her hand into her pocket and pressed a single button on her phone, dialing her husband, Noah. She didn't speak, didn't give away what she was doing, but she knew Noah would understand. He always did. Joe, oblivious to the call, clicked the cuffs around her wrists with a sense of triumph. "Let's see how confident you are behind bars," he sneered. Millie said nothing as he led her to his cruiser. She sat in the back seat, her expression calm, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin, and she knew Noah would be listening. His quiet fury building with every word. At the station, Joe paraded Millie inside as if he'd caught a notorious criminal. He ignored the questioning looks from his colleagues, too wrapped up in his own sense of power. As he processed her arrest, he continued his barrage of insults, belittling her at every turn. "You should be grateful I'm not pressing more charges," he said, leaning against the desk. "Your attitude doesn't match your status. People like you should learn their place." Millie met his gaze with unwavering calm. "You're making a mistake," she said again. "But don't worry, you'll understand soon enough." Joe laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "We'll see about that." Unbeknownst to him, Noah was already on his way. At the police station, the air was tense, but Millie remained composed. She sat quietly in the holding cell, her posture upright and dignified, as if the bars around her couldn't contain her spirit. The station was bustling with activity, officers going about their business, filing reports, taking calls, and responding to emergencies. Yet, amidst this controlled chaos, Millie's presence seemed to radiate an unshakable calm. She was far from the first person to find themselves unjustly behind bars, but she carried herself as though she were already free. Joe, meanwhile, was reveling in his small moment of perceived power. He leaned casually against his desk, smirking to himself as he recounted the arrest to a colleague. "She thought she could talk her way out of it," he said, shaking his head. "But I put her in her place. People like her need to understand that this isn't their playground." The other officer raised an eyebrow, clearly uncomfortable with Joe's tone. "What exactly did she do?" he asked hesitantly. Joe waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, she was wearing some expensive chain, probably stolen. When I asked her about it, she got all defensive." "Typical." "Did she resist?" the officer pressed. "No," Joe admitted, his smirk faltering slightly. "But you can tell the type, arrogant, acting like they're better than us." The officer nodded slowly, though it was clear he wasn't convinced. He glanced toward the holding cell, where Millie sat with quiet dignity, and then back at Joe. "Are you sure about this?" "Of course I'm sure," Joe snapped, his ego flaring. "Don't start questioning me now." In the meantime, Millie's phone call was already setting events in motion. Noah, her husband and the police captain, was driving toward the station with a sense of purpose. He had heard the entire exchange between Millie and Joe, his jaw tightening with every word. Noah wasn't just angry, he was deeply disappointed. He knew Joe's reputation, but this was beyond anything he had expected. As Noah pulled into the station parking lot, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't just here as Millie's husband, he was here as a leader, someone who had sworn to uphold justice and fairness. He walked into the station with a calm yet commanding presence, his eyes immediately finding Millie in the holding cell. Their eyes met, and in that moment, they communicated volumes without saying a word. Joe, noticing Noah's arrival, straightened up, his smirk fading. "Captain," he said, trying to sound casual, "what brings you here?" Noah's gaze was piercing as he turned to Joe. "I think you know exactly why I'm here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Care to explain why my wife is in a holding cell?" Joe's face paled, and for the first time his arrogance wavered. Your wife?" he stammered. "I didn't know." "That's the problem, Joe," Noah interrupted. "You didn't know, you didn't ask, you just assumed, and now you've made a grave mistake." The station fell silent as all eyes turned to the scene unfolding. Noah walked over to the holding cell, unlocking it with a set of keys he had taken from the front desk. Millie stood, her composure never faltering, and stepped out, her golden chain catching the light once more. "Let this be a lesson to everyone here," Noah said, addressing the room. "We are here to serve and protect, not to judge and oppress. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated." Joe stood frozen, his ego shattered, as Noah and Millie walked out of the station together. At their heads held high, The incident would not be forgotten, and changes would come, slowly but surely. For now, Millie and Noah had each other, and that was enough to face whatever came next. Joe sat in the circle, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, as Sandra and Hector shared their stories. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, a mix of guilt and discomfort he couldn't shake. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated, his voice trembling. I don't know where to start," he admitted, his eyes darting around the room. "I guess I never really thought about how my actions affected others. I didn't see it." The facilitator, a soft-spoken but firm woman named Dr. Patel, leaned forward. "Joe, this isn't about shaming you. It's about understanding. Can you tell us what brought you here?" Joe swallowed hard. "I arrested a woman. I thought she was suspicious, but I was wrong. She was my captain's wife. I didn't know who she was, but that's not the point. The point is, I judged her based on how she looked, and I treated her like she was less than me. And now I'm here." The room was silent for a moment before Sandra spoke up. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong, but you're here. That's a start." Over the next few weeks, Joe was forced to confront his biases head-on. The camp wasn't just about lectures and discussions. It was immersive. He was assigned to volunteer at a community center in a predominantly black neighborhood, where he tutored kids and helped organize food drives. At first, he felt out of place, like an outsider. But as he got to know the people there, people like Sandra, who ran the center, and Hector, who volunteered alongside him, he began to see things differently. One afternoon, as he was helping a young boy named Marcus with his math homework, Marcus looked up at him and asked, "Why are you here, Mr. Joe? You don't look like you're from around here." Joe paused, unsure how to answer. "I made some mistakes," he said finally, "and now I'm trying to learn how to be better." Marcus tilted his head, considering this. "That's cool. My mom says it's never too late to change." Those words stuck with Joe. He thought about them during his therapy sessions, where he dug deep into his upbringing and the attitudes he'd inherited without question. He realized how much of his behavior had been shaped by fear and ignorance, and how little he'd done to challenge those beliefs. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Noah kept a close eye on Joe's progress. He wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet, but he respected Millie's belief in second chances. Millie, for her part, continued to advocate for Joe, even as some of her friends questioned her compassion. "If we don't give people the opportunity to change," she told them, "how will anything ever get better?" 6 months passed, and Joe's final evaluation at the camp arrived. He stood before a panel of facilitators, including Dr. Patel, and shared what he'd learned. "I used to think I was a good person," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "But I realize now that being a good person isn't about what you think you are. It's about what you do. It's about how you treat people, especially when it's hard. I'm not perfect, and I know I still have a lot to learn, but I'm committed to doing better." Patel nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Joe, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. The real test is what you do from here." When Joe returned to the precinct, he was met with mixed reactions. Some of his colleagues welcomed him back cautiously, while others kept their distance. Noah called him into his office on his first day back. "I'm not going to pretend this is easy," Noah said, his tone firm but not unkind. "You've got a long road ahead of you, but if you're serious about changing, I'll give you a chance to prove it." Joe nodded, his heart pounding. "Thank you, Captain. I won't let you down." Over the next few months, Joe worked tirelessly to rebuild trust. He volunteered for community outreach programs, mentored new officers on the importance of bias awareness, and even started a book club at the precinct focused on racial justice and equality. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt and frustration, but he kept going, driven by the memory of Marcus's words and the hope that he could make a difference. One evening, as he was leaving the station, he ran into Millie. She was there to pick up Noah, and she smiled when she saw him. "Joe," she said warmly. "How are you?" "I'm good," he replied, surprised by how much her kindness meant to him. "Thank you, Millie. For everything." She nodded, her eyes soft but knowing. "Change is hard, Joe, but it's worth it." As he watched her walk away, Joe felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. And that, he realized, was a start. Joe stood at the podium, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The room was filled with colleagues, community leaders, and people whose lives he had once impacted in the worst way. The award in his hands, a recognition of his efforts to bridge the gap between the police force and the community, felt both like an honor and a reminder of how far he had come. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Millie and Captain Noah. Their presence, their smiles, gave him the courage to speak. "I owe everything to the people who believed I could change," Joe began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "And to those who didn't give up on me, even when I didn't deserve it, thank you for giving me a second chance." The applause that followed was deafening. But Joe's mind was already drifting back to the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been easy. After that first dinner with Millie and Noah, Joe had thrown himself into his work with a newfound purpose. He didn't just lead anti-racism workshops, he immersed himself in them, learning as much from the recruits as they did from him. He started attending community meetings, listening to the stories of people who had been marginalized, abused, or ignored by the system he had once upheld without question. One evening, after a particularly intense workshop, a young recruit approached him. "Officer Joe," she said hesitantly, "I don't know if I can do this. I mean, how do you make sure you don't mess up?" Joe had smiled, though the question hit close to home. "You will mess up," he admitted. "I did. A lot. But the key is to keep listening, keep learning, and own your mistakes. It's not about being perfect, it's about being willing to grow." Over time, Joe's efforts began to ripple through the precinct. Officers who had once been skeptical of his transformation started to see the impact of his work. Complaints against the department dropped, and community trust began to rebuild, brick by brick. Joe's story became a beacon of hope, not just for the police force, but for the city as a whole. But the road wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when Joe doubted himself, when the weight of his past mistakes felt too heavy to bear. On one particularly hard day, he found himself standing outside Millie's cafe, hesitating before walking in. She was behind the counter as always, and when she saw him, she smiled. "Rough day?" she asked, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter. Joe nodded, gripping the cup like a lifeline. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," he confessed. "If I'll ever really make up for what I've done." Millie leaned on the counter, her expression thoughtful. "Joe, you can't change the past. But every day, you're choosing to make the future better. That's what matters." Her words stayed with him. A reminder that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a better tomorrow. And Joe was determined to do just that. Years passed, and Joe's influence grew. He became a mentor to countless officers, a bridge between the police and the community, and a living testament to the power of change. He even started a program that paired new recruits with community leaders, fostering dialogue and understanding from the very beginning of their careers. At the precinct ceremony, as Joe stepped down from the podium, he was met with handshakes, hugs, and words of gratitude. But the moment that meant the most came when Millie approached him, her eyes shining with pride. "You've come a long way, Joe," she said softly. "I'm proud of you." Joe felt a lump rise in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. "You showed me what it means to be human." As the evening wound down, Joe stood at the edge of the room, watching the crowd mingle. Captain Noah joined him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've done good, Joe," he said. "Real good." Joe smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. "It's not over," he said. "There's still a lot of work to do." Noah nodded. "And you'll be there to do it." Joe knew he would. Change wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And for the first time in his life, Joe was proud to be on that path. As he left the ceremony that night, the cool evening air brushing against his face, Joe felt a sense of clarity. He had spent so much of his life blind to the pain he caused, but now he saw, truly saw, the impact of his actions. And he was committed to using that vision to make the world a better place, one step at a time. The road ahead was long, but Joe was ready. For the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.